On April 17, 1955, Albert Einstein was hospitalized with chest pain. He did not realize it at the time, but the largest vessel in his body, the part of the aorta where it descends into his abdomen, had swollen and ruptured, and he was suffering from an internal bleeding, an abdominal aortic aneurysm. At the time, he was busy preparing a televised speech to celebrate Israel's 7th anniversary. His doctors wanted to operate on him immediately, but he said, "I will die when I want to die. There is no point in artificially prolonging life. I've done my part, it's time for me to go. I'm going to go gracefully," and indeed she passed away early the next day at Plainsboro Hospital in Princeton. Those of you who have seen House MD know the name of this hospital. In fact, the hospital shown in the show has nothing to do with Einstein's death, but the writers of the show probably chose the name deliberately. But the really interesting thing happened during Einstein's autopsy. Just 7 hours after the great genius died, Thomas Harvey, the pathologist who performed the autopsy, cut Einstein's brain out of his body without the permission of his family, injected it with 10% formalin and froze it. His aim was to study this brain, which he believed to be unique, to discover what made him so brilliant. But Einstein hated the idolization of himself, and so he wanted his body cremated and his ashes scattered in secret. So Harvey broke Einstein's will. Moreover, he removed not only his brain, but also his eyes, and gave them to Henry Ambrams, Einstein's ophthalmologist. When the doctor realized he was going to get burned, he went to Einstein's son Hans and managed to convince him of the importance of what he had done and to get retroactive permission. This avoided legal liability, but Hans had one condition: that his father's brain would only be analyzed for scientific research and that the results would be published in reputable academic journals. Harvey promised and said he would publish his findings within a year at the latest. And indeed, Einstein's brain has been the subject of more than one study since then. What have researchers found? Can we find traces of this great genius in his brain? Let's take a look. The most common myth about Einstein is that, despite being so smart, he did as badly in school as the rest of us. It's not hard to see why people want to believe this. If even Einstein was treated like an idiot in school, we can be like Einstein in the future. That's partly why I made this video. If you correctly identify what made Einstein Einstein, you can be like him, or even better than him. But if you want to succeed, first and foremost, you have to stop lying to yourself. Of course, school grades alone don't determine the future, but that doesn't change the fact that Einstein's grades were pretty good. How do we know that? For example, this is his report card from his senior year of high school on September 30th, 1896. If you look carefully at the report card, you can see that he got a 6 in algebra, geometry, physics and history, a 5 in chemistry, natural history and German language and literature, and a 4 in drawing and geography. His lowest grade was a 3 in French language and literature. Not bad at all. And Einstein was not only successful in high school. Einstein's mother, Pauline, wrote a letter to her sister when Einstein first started school saying, "Yesterday, Albert received his report card. He is again at the top of his class, and his report card is excellent." So Einstein was a very good student throughout his school life. Of course, like any student, he had his disagreements with his teachers. For example, in middle school, at the Luitpold Gymnasium, as it was then called, one of his teachers said, "I wish Einstein hadn't been my student." But it wasn't because Einstein was lazy or anything. It was because he sat in the back row and often smiled at his lectures. The teacher felt that Einstein didn't respect him, and so at one point he became angry and said, "You'll never amount to anything." But we can't judge a person's whole school life on these isolated anecdotes. We have to look at the overall achievement and grades. And when we do that, we see that Einstein was not a failure at all. Well then, as I said, why do people keep spreading this nonsense? There is something comforting about believing that Einstein was treated as an idiot by the education system, and Einstein, like many of us, hated the militaristic tone of the schools and the systematic way of education. He wrote about it again and again in his letters, but that's not the only reason. Another potential source for the claim that Einstein's grades were bad was the grading system used in Switzerland. Einstein was born in Imperial Germany on March 14, 1879, and studied there until high school. In Germany's school system, 1 was the highest grade, and 6 was the lowest, the opposite of Switzerland. So his report cards before he started studying in Switzerland were always full of 1s, the highest grade, but many people confuse it with the Swiss system. and think that this is the lowest grade. And what makes things even more confusing is that the Swiss high school followed the German grading system until 1896, Einstein's last year at school, but then they reversed the grades. In other words, they switched to the system that they used in the report card that I just showed you, and they started using 6 as the highest grade and 1 as the lowest grade. All this adds to the confusion, but as far as we can see from his parents' letters and other surviving records, Einstein's grades were always good or very good. So what was the reason for Einstein's good grades, or for his later genius? Could the secret have been in his brain? This is a question that has fascinated scientists for decades, not just Einstein, but in general. Do you think we can identify specifically in the brain what makes geniuses geniuses? Are these geniuses born that way? Or are they so obsessed with a certain subject that certain parts of their brains are overdeveloped? We have some clues as to whether we can discern this thanks to the pathologist Harvey's hasty decision, perhaps uncharacteristically, to become fascinated by the magnitude of the genius and mystery that lay before him. After removing Einstein's brain, Harvey took dozens of different photographs and then, together with his mentor, Harry Zimmerman, cut it into 240 pieces of roughly 10 cubic centimeters each, from which he prepared microscope slides. These brain sections were based on the Atlas of the Cerebral Cortex, published by von Economo and Koskinas in 1925, and largely followed the brain regions identified by Brodmann in the 19th century, meaning that the sections were chosen to correspond to groups of the brain with specific functions. But the problem was that neither Harvey nor his mentor Zimmerman had any expertise in neuroscience and the brain. They were both pathologists, and at most, they were able to identify specific pathological conditions such as brain injury or hemorrhages, so they lacked the equipment to unlock the secrets of the extraordinary brain they had. So Harvey was never able to fulfill his promise to Hans Einstein to publish in a year's time. He was never able to identify anything that he could publish, because he didn't know what to look for, and this soon became a big problem. Even though he had Hans' permission, the chief physician of his hospital decided that this was inexcusable, and he was forced to resign a few days after the incident for breach of ethics. Unable to find work in New Jersey for a long time, Harvey emigrated to the Midwestern United States with the 2 large jars containing Einstein's brain, where he began working as a general practitioner. Harvey was described as highly eccentric, even delusional, and for this reason, no academic took him seriously. For 30 years after Einstein's death, he could not convince anyone to study Einstein's brain. Finally, he traveled across America to give it to Einstein's grandson in California, who refused to take it, so Einstein's brain became a curse. After all these events, and after a long time of going back and forth with the brain, he finally went back to where he started and handed over the jars of brain fragments to the pathologist hired in his position, and that was the end of his 40-year adventure. From that point on, researchers began to pay a little more attention to Einstein's brain. The first study on Einstein's brain was published in 1999, 44 years after Einstein died. Since then, several other studies have examined the remains of Einstein's brain and original photographs, and the findings so far are quite interesting. First of all, Einstein's brain is not larger than average. On the contrary, it is quite small. A man of Einstein's age and weight at the time of his death would have had a brain of around 1,400 grams, while Einstein's was only 1,230 grams. So when it comes to the brain, there is no rule that the bigger the better. For example, a brain can be relatively small but full of tighter neural connections and therefore have a higher processing capacity. But variations in Einstein's brain were detected beyond that. Let me show you a few of them directly. Look, this is the brain of an average person. This is your frontal cortex, the front part of your brain. This is the right hemisphere, and this is the left hemisphere. The space in between is what we call the longitudinal fissure, which separates the 2 cerebral hemispheres and contains the connecting bridge called the corpus callosum. If you notice, on this front side of the brain, there are roughly 3 lines, 3 gyrus. 1, 2, 3. Now, let's look at one of the photographs of Einstein's brain taken by Harvey, looking at it from the same angle. Notice, here is the space separating the 2 hemispheres. Now, let's count these outlines again. 1, 2, 3 to 4. There seems to be 1 extra gyrus in 10. This redundancy is in the right frontal lobe, so you are not surprised at all about our non-verbal math-like abilities, are you? It's not over yet. Let's look at another point. Do you see this huge curve in the same photo? Now look at the standard human brain. There is no such fold. This is a region called the hand motor knob, or the omega sign for short, because of its similarity to the Greek letter omega. It's responsible for the nimble movements of our hands and fingers. And we know from previous studies that people who started playing the violin between the ages of 6 and 14 have this kind of knob in their brains. So just by looking at this brain, we can say that Einstein played the violin with his right hand, and that he started playing the violin before the age of 14. Indeed, Einstein took up the violin at the age of 6, under the guidance of his pianist mother, and he never put it down for the rest of his life. Let's look at a new photograph. Here we see Einstein's left brain from the front, and look, here is the fissure that divides the brain in two. Even if you don't know anything about the brain, do you notice anything abnormal in what you have seen so far? Look at the size of this fissure. In a normal person, the same structure should be like the others. This is the motor cortex of the brain, the area that controls our voluntary functions like hand movements. Another finding, which I can't show with a photo like this, was reached by counting the nerve cells in Einstein's brain sections one by one under a microscope, and it was found that the number of neurons in the Brodmann area number 39 on the left side of the brain was less than in a normal person. This area is involved in word comprehension and language perception, and indeed Einstein did not speak fluently until he was 6 years old, and for a long time he suffered from dyslexia-like problems, such as not being able to write down thoughts, not being able to remember words, not being able to read aloud. So Einstein did not learn to read at the age of 2 and start thinking about abstract mathematics at the age of 4, like some other geniuses. I will come back to this in a moment. By the way, let me tell you that the most obvious differences in Einstein's brain are, interestingly enough, in the parts related to motor functions and the senses. In fact, this explains very well another fact that we know about Einstein. Einstein laughed when he was told that he was not a person who thought in writing or in words, but rather that most people have an inner voice that thinks in words. Einstein thought more in colors and music. I mean, he was a synesthete, for example. When Einstein was stuck on a problem, instead of sitting at work and doing calculations, sometimes he would play the violin for hours, and suddenly he would stop and say, "Oh, I've got it," and then he would put it into mathematics. Einstein's way of perceiving the universe was also quite extraordinary. When Einstein thought about the universe, he did not rely on mathematics or experiment, as other physicists do, but on aesthetics. This is best described by Paul Dirac, another great physicist, who said, "Einstein did not try to build a theory that agreed with observation. He would try to think, if I were God, would I have created this part of the universe like this? And depending on his answer to that, he would decide whether he liked a theory or not." It's a very interesting philosophy of life, driven by aesthetics, and it made Einstein right and wrong throughout his life. When he was developing the theory of relativity, especially the special theory of relativity, which says that space-time is part of the same fabric, he was very much guided by this aesthetic perception, but at the same time, when he was trying to develop the general theory of relativity, which generalizes this theory, this aesthetic approach, blocked his discovery for about 2 years. Because he preferred the more aesthetic to the more mathematical, he was constantly going down the wrong path. When he finally put his aesthetic perception aside and let himself go with the flow of mathematics, he was able to develop the general theory of relativity, which explains the interaction of mass with the fabric of space-time. Seeing the success that this change of perspective brought him, he built the rest of his life with a purely mathematical perception, without aesthetics, and this obviously resulted in him being relatively less productive in the second half of his life. Also, because he built his theory of relativity on top of classical physics, he never warmed up to quantum mechanics, which destroyed classical physics during his lifetime, and that made him make a lot of mistakes. These are very interesting points that are the subject of other videos. If you like this kind of videos, please don't forget to subscribe and turn on channel notifications now. Of course, there were other findings in Einstein's brain that reflect his genius for math and physics. For example, we see that his left parietal lobe, which is particularly responsible for math, reading and writing long texts, and symbolic thinking, was 15% larger than normal. There are also some studies showing that the hippocampus, which is associated with memory, and the neocortex, which is associated with higher cognitive functions, are relatively large in the left brain. Finally, the corpus callosum, which connects the two cerebral hemispheres, was also denser than a normal person, which explains why his brain worked like a supercomputer. Long story short, there are definitely distinguishable differences in Einstein's brain. The critical question now is, was Einstein born with this brain anatomy and that's why he was so smart, or did he spend years in high-level mathematics and physics and the associated regions of his brain developed over time? Let's be clear about one thing. The brain is by no means a static structure. It is more like a hot plastic that you can bend and twist into any shape you want. We call this neuroplasticity. For example, when you first learn the basics of math or physics in elementary school, some of the 100 billion or so neurons in your brain form brand new connections to process this new information. The more you focus on these areas, the more you go over things you don't understand, the stronger and more numerous the connections become. So, as you learn, the structure of your brain changes. On the other hand, in most cases, these connections only occur on a microscopic scale, so it is very difficult for them to make differences on a macro scale. That is, on a scale that can affect the folds of the brain, as we have just seen in the photos. For example, by the age of 6, the human brain has already reached 90% of its adult form. So, if experience does affect the curvature of the brain, it has to start before the age of 6. For example, we know that Einstein was not thinking about physics at that age. Einstein became interested in science at the age of 5 with a compass he received from his father, but he only started to think about these subjects 5 to 10 years later. On the other hand, we still know very little about the impact of our later experiences on brain folds and macroanatomy. So, based on the current data, it is very likely that Einstein was born with at least a significant part of these variations in the brain. On the other hand, many historians of physics agree that the main elements that made Einstein were his environment and what happened in his life. So, since that's our subject here, we focused on Einstein's brain, and we didn't look at what happened in his life, the events that shaped his character, and the way he thought. But I can say this: Einstein did not become a genius just because of his innate abilities. For example, his childhood learning difficulties probably forced him to think and learn in different and new ways. Also, Einstein knew how to obsess over certain problems and pursue them doggedly. Even when he worked in a patent office to gain financial independence, he never stopped thinking about problems in physics and following the work of the most respected scholars in the field. Thanks to this hard work, perseverance, and determination, he was able to turn his talent into a product. Otherwise, no one can discover the secrets of the universe from where they sit. As study after study has shown, in many cases, genius is not just about genes, not just about brain anatomy, not just about hard work, not just about luck, not just about socioeconomic status, not just about the environment, but about all of these in different amounts in different situations. And yes, maybe Einstein was born with genes or a brain that made it easier for him to turn things in his favor. Or maybe you weren't born with a brain like Einstein's, or maybe your school grades were as bad as Einstein's. You can't change those things anymore, but there are things you can change. And many people almost never use the things that are in their control, like the power of neuroplasticity or the ability to put themselves in positions that can lead to success. The defense that they don't do these things and then say, "My brain is not like Einstein's, that's why I didn't become a genius," is utter nonsense. Let me just say one last thing here. The next time you are learning something new or thinking deeply and insightfully about something, imagine not only that you are gaining new knowledge, but also that the connections in your brain are physically changing and transforming. This will also increase your enjoyment of the subject. Try it and you will see. You are on the Interesting Topics channel. Don't forget to subscribe for more valuable content. See you in the next video.